Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
This past Monday, the Wall Street Journal hosted its annual
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I'd ask consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor to comment on the NDAA, the bill in front of us today, and I want to just start my remarks by acknowledging the leadership of Chairman Levin, Ranking Member McCain. Under their tutelage and leadership, the committee's worked tirelessly to craft a Defense Authorization Act that provides our armed forces with the equipment, the services, the training, and the overall support that they need to keep us safe while they themselves are being protected. And I want to thank the chairman, the ranking member, my SAS colleagues, and I think most importantly the wonderful staff that work for us for their diligence and dedication to this important work. Mr. President, I also come to the floor to speak out against a proposed change that would, I think, alter what has been a very effective set of terrorist detention policies and procedures. And I believe to make those changes would complicate our capacity to prosecute the war on terror and call into question the principles that we as Americans hold dear. And, Mr. President, I filed an amendment that would, 1107, that would take a look at what is proposed in the NDAA. Now, we have a solemn obligation, Mr. President, to pass a National Defense Authorization Act, but we also have a solemn obligation to make sure that those who are fighting the war on terror have the best, most flexible, most powerful tools possible. And I have to say again, and I will say it more than two times in my remarks, that I'm worried that these changes that we're about to push through would actually hurt our national security. I am a proud member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And as I've implied, and I want to be explicit, I understand the importance of this bill, and I understand what it does for our military, which is why, in sum, what I'm going to propose with my amendment is that we pass the NDAA without these troubling new provisions, but with a mechanism by which we can consider what's been proposed and perhaps at a later date include any applicable changes in the law. But we need to hear from the Department of Defense, our intelligence community, and the administration more broadly on what our men and women in the field actually need to effectively prosecute the war on terror, especially before we change detainee policies that are already working. Mr. President, as I'm saying, I've got really serious concerns about the detainee provisions that have been included in the bill. In my opinion and the opinion of many others, and I will share those opinions and insights with my colleagues, these provisions disrupt the executive branch's capacity to enforce the law and impose unwise and unwarranted restrictions on our ability to aggressively combat international terrorism. And in so doing, they inject legal uncertainty and ambiguity that may only complicate the military's operations and detention practices. Now, Mr. President, I'm not the only one that has serious concerns. The Secretary of Defense has urged us to oppose these new provisions. Both the chairman of the Intelligence and Judiciary Committees strongly oppose them, and the President's team is recommending a veto. These are people whose opinions should be carefully considered before we put these new proposals into our legal framework. In the Statement of Administrative Policy, the White House states, quote, "We have spent 10 years since September 11, 2001 breaking down the walls between intelligence, military, and law enforcement professionals. Congress should not now rebuild those walls and unnecessarily make the job of preventing terrorist attacks more difficult." End of quote. Those are striking words, Mr. President, that should give us all pause as we face seems to me, a bit of a rush to cement these untested and legally controversial restrictions on our ability to prosecute terrorists. And, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to replace the entire Statement of Administrative Policy in the record.
Without objection.
These are complex issues that have far-reaching consequences for our military, our civilian law enforcement agencies, and our intelligence community as they work to keep Americans safe from harm. Despite this fact, the Department of Defense and the National Security staff, as far as I know, had little opportunity to review or comment on the final language in the provisions. And as a result, these provisions restrain the executive branch's options to utilize in a swift and flexible fashion all the counterterrorism tools that are now legally available. That quote comes directly from a letter addressed to the Armed Services Committee from Secretary Panetta. And I think we all know that Mr. Panetta was also, before he held the job that he has now, Secretary of Defense, he was the director of the CIA. So he very well knows the threats facing our country, and he knows that we cannot afford to make mistakes when it comes to keeping our citizens safe. And, Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that Secretary Panetta's letter be entered into the record.
Without objection.
The provisions I'm speaking to are well-intended. I have much admiration for my colleagues who proposed them, but I think we need to take some more time to consider the ramifications. The United States, our country, can currently choose from several options when prosecuting terrorists. That flexibility has allowed us to try, convict, and imprison hundreds of terrorists. And it allows the government to select the venue that will provide the highest likelihood of obtaining a conviction. The current detention provisions in the bill we are debating would strip away that flexibility and potentially impair our capacity to successfully prosecute and convict terrorists. It's not clear to me why, after 10 years of successfully prosecuting terrorists and preventing another 9/11-like attack, why we would want to limit our options while our enemies are constantly adapting their tactics and expanding their efforts to do us harm. In a recent op-ed in the Chicago Times, a bipartisan group of 3 former federal judges, including William S. Sessions, who was also the appointed director of the FBI under President Reagan, said it best when describing these provisions. Quote, "Legislation now making its way through Congress would seek to over-militarize America's counterterrorism efforts, effectively making the U.S. military the judge, jury, and jailer of terrorism suspects to the exclusion of the FBI and local and state law enforcement agencies. As former federal judges, we find this prospect deeply disturbing. Not only would such an effort ignore 200 years of legal precedent, it would fly in the face of common sense." End of quote. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that that op-ed be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would also point out that these provisions also raise serious questions as to who we are as a society and what our Constitution seeks to protect. One section of these provisions, Section 1031, could be interpreted as allowing the military to capture and indefinitely detain American citizens on U.S. soil. Section 1031 essentially repeals the Posse Comitatus Act of 1873 by authorizing the military to perform law enforcement functions on American soil. That alone should alarm my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. But there are other problems with these provisions that must be resolved. These detainee provisions are unnecessary, counterproductive, and potentially harmful to our counterterrorism efforts. And, Mr. President, I know I've said this a couple of times already, but it feels like they're being rushed through in a manner that doesn't serve us well. The Department of Defense has had little input. There have been no hearings. And earlier this week, the changes were presented to us in the Armed Services Committee just hours before we were asked to vote on them. These are just too important a set of questions to let them pass without a thorough review and far greater understanding of their effect on our national security and our fight against terrorism. It feels to me, to this senator, that we're rushing hastily to address a solution in search of a problem. And we ought to hear from the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and our colleagues in other relevant committees before we act. Do we really believe that this Congress, again, let me underline, after 10 years of successfully prosecuting the war on terror, should substitute its views for that of our defense, intelligence, and homeland security leadership without careful analysis? Mr. President, I recently received a letter signed by 18 retired military leaders in opposition to these provisions. The letter states that, quote, mandating military custody would undermine legitimate law enforcement and intelligence operations crucial to our security at home and abroad. Mr. President, I couldn't agree more. And I'd ask unanimous consent that this letter be included in the record.
Without objection.
We are already trying and convicting terrorists in both civilian courts and under military commissions. The provisions that are in this bill would require the DOD to shift significant resources away from their mission to act on all the fronts all over the world, and they would become a police force and jailers. This is not what they're good at. This is not what we want them to do, and I think it has potentially dangerous consequences because we have limited resources, limited manpower. We wouldn't lose anything by taking a little bit more time to discuss and debate these provisions. But we could do real harm to our national security by allowing this language, unscrutinized, to pass, and that's precisely what our highest-ranking national security officers are warning us against doing. Now, this is a debate we need to have. It's a healthy debate, but we ought to be armed with all of the facts and expertise before we move forward. The least we can do is take our time, be diligent, and hear from those who will be affected by these new limitations on our ability to prosecute terrorists. And it concerns me, Mr. President, that we would tell our national security leadership, a bipartisan national security leadership, by the way, that we wouldn't listen to them and that Congress knows better than they do. It doesn't strike me that that's the best way to secure and protect the American people. So, Mr. President, that's why I have filed Amendment 1107. I think it's a common-sense alternative that will protect our constitutional principles and beliefs while also allowing us to keep our nation safe. The amendment has a clear aim to ensure that we follow a thorough process and hear all views before rushing forward with new laws that could be harmful to our national security. Mr. President, what's in the amendment? It's straightforward. Specifically, the amendment would require that our defense, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies report to Congress with recommendations for any additional authorities or flexibility that they need in order to detain and prosecute terrorists. In other words, let's not put the horse before the cart or fix something that isn't broken. Let's first hear from the stakeholders as to what laws they believe need to be changed to give them better tools to do their jobs. My amendment would then ask for hearings to be held so we can fully understand the views of respected national security experts. And moreover, it would require input from each of the relevant committees to ensure that we have carefully considered the benefits and consequences of our actions. The chairman of our Judiciary and Intelligence Committees have deep concerns about the detainee provisions in the pending legislation. And of course, Mr. President, as we underwent this process, the existing laws that guide our actions today would remain in place. They've been successful. I see some of my colleagues who I think share my views who've come to the floor. They've also made the compelling case that it's a system that's working. Why would we change it without really thinking it through? It's straightforward, it's common sense, and it allows us to make sure we will win the war on terror.
Would the senator from Colorado yield for a question through the chair?
Yes.
I thank the senator from Colorado for his strong statement, and I totally support his position. This change in the Defense Authorization Bill goes beyond a military decision. It goes to the fundamental questions and principles of our Constitution and our body of law. As a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I believe this matter should have been considered as well by the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I believe Senator Feinstein has expressed the feeling that it should have been considered as well by the Senate Intelligence Committee. But I would like to ask the senator from Colorado one very specific example, use one example to ask him a question. When we had the so-called underwear bomber, the passenger on a commercial aircraft who tried to detonate a bomb and thank God was unsuccessful, He was subdued, arrested, and interrogated by the Federal Bureau of Investigations in Detroit. After that investigation was underway and he surrendered some information, he stopped talking, at which point the FBI investigators read him his Miranda rights. Then later, working with his parents, he resumed talking to the investigators and literally, according to the FBI, gave a dramatic amount of information helpful to us in keeping America safe and stopping terrorism. He was then prosecuted in the criminal courts of America, Article III courts, and ultimately just weeks ago pled guilty.
Senator, state his question.
I'm going to. I would say to the senator from Arizona, I think it's important we take some time on this important issue. And I'm glad the senator from Colorado has...
And I would say it's important that all voices be heard.
Senator from McCain, of course, as the ranking member, will have ample opportunity to express his point of view. What I'm asking the senator from Colorado is this. Taking into consideration the language that is now being presented in this defense authorization bill, particularly Section 1032, it is my understanding that the Federal Bureau of Investigations could not have continued their interrogation of this suspected terrorist without first contacting our military and bringing them in to determine whether or not they had jurisdiction over this matter. In other words, time would have been lost, opportunities would have been lost, information might have been lost by following the new section in the bill. I'm asking the senator from Colorado if this is a decision which he believes we should make in the haste of a defense authorization bill, or ought to step back and work with the President of the United States, the FBI, the military, and our intelligence forces to make sure we do not lose an opportunity to catch a terrorist and catch an alleged terrorist, to interrogate them, and to keep this country safe.
I thank the senator from Illinois for his question. My understanding is the senator from Illinois is correct, that 1032, provision 1032, would change the way in which interrogations would unfold. Now, there may be some in the Senate who see it differently, but that's all the more reason to adopt my amendment, which would put us through a process of hearing from the very experts who interrogated the underwear bomber, of other experts who've been on the front lines in fighting terrorism. We ought to go slow. We shouldn't fix something that is working just fine right now. So I thank the senator for his question.
If the senator from Arizona will forgive me, I'd like to ask one more question through the chair. And the question goes back to the point that you made. Section 1031, as I understand it, would be a departure from current law and would say that those who are not American citizens, those who are American citizens can be detained indefinitely if they are suspected of certain terrorist conduct. I asked the senator from Colorado, is that the point that you made in your statement?
The senator from Illinois is correct. 1031 would do just that, and it would come directly at a piece of law, posse comitatus, which dates back to the Civil War, that's held dear by all of us in America because it distinguishes between the military used to protect us against foreign foes and how we manage our own civil affairs here at home.
Thank you,
it also, as the senator alludes to, I think, cause questions to be raised about something that's very sacred in our system of law, which is the writ of habeas corpus. You have to prove why you hold somebody. You cannot detain an American citizen indefinitely in any other circumstance. So I thank the senator for his questions. I would yield the floor.
Would the senator yield for a question?
I'd be happy to yield for a question.
We explicitly wrote into this bill the following language, that the procedures providing for the determination that somebody is an al-Qaeda terrorist or related affiliated one is not required to be implemented until after the conclusion of the interrogation session, which is ongoing at the time the determination is made. Is the senator familiar with that language which explicitly says that the President will adopt the procedures, whatever procedures the President determines, to make sure that there is no interference with an ongoing interrogation by the civilians as it appears in Section C2C on page 363. Is the senator familiar with that?
I'm familiar with the language in the general way in which it's been introduced I would say to the Chairman of the Armed Services Committee that we had a chance to review this language starting about 48 hours ago. But one of the reasons I think my amendment is important is it would give those voices which are being heard more and more as of today who have concerns with this provision, they're not sure how it applies, that's all the more reason to slow this down, to keep the existing law in place and go through a more thorough process to understand what the ramifications of the waiver provision and other provisions that the chairman and the ranking member.
Well, is it not true, however, that the language which is in this bill, which I've just read, clearly provides that there will not be any interference with an interrogation session, that those procedures are to be determined by the President, and that it explicitly says there will not be any interference with interrogation, and the procedures will guarantee that there will not be. That's the point of this language. I don't understand how the statement can be made that this language in this bill interferes with the interrogation by civilian authorities in the FBI when the very language here says they will not interfere with that interrogation. I'm wondering if the Senator could explain to me his agreement with the Senator from Illinois that something in this bill would result in an interference with an interrogation.
What I say to my friend is that having just had an opportunity to review this language for the last 48 hours, that I have no question about his intent, but I have heard from people with much greater expertise than I have that there are questions that are still unanswered. It may be that this provision is appropriate and will do just what the chairman says it will do, but I think, again, that's why I think it would be well worth our time to take a further look at what is involved in these provisions.
Well, and I do appreciate the Senator's response to that. I have just one other question, and that has to do with somebody, an American citizen that is captured in the United States and the application of the custody pending a presidential waiver to such a person. I'm wondering whether the Senator is familiar with the fact that the language which precluded the application of Section 1031 to American citizens was in the bill that we originally approved in the Armed Services Committee, and the administration asked us to remove the language which says that U.S. citizens and lawful residents would not be subject to this section. Is the Senator familiar with the fact that it was the administration that asked us to remove the very language which we had in the bill which passed the committee, and that we removed it at the request of the administration that would have said that this determination would not apply to U.S. citizens and lawful residents? I'm just wondering, is the Senator familiar with the fact that it was the administration which asked us to remove the very language, the absence of which is now objected to by the Senator from Illinois?
I'm familiar now because the Senator from Michigan has shared that fact with me. I'm also familiar with the fact that the administration has other questions and concerns, which has caused it to issue a set of provisions and issues that they would like further considered.
I thank my friend.
Thank you. I'd be happy to yield to my friend from Vermont.
Is the Senator from Colorado aware that there have been questions raised by the administration, some real concerns by both DOD and the White House, saying that requiring the President to devise the kind of procedures just been discussed creates all kinds of problems, and that is one of the reasons why both the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee is asked to at least have a hearing on a section that obviously involves the jurisdiction of both Senate Intelligence and Senate Judiciary.
I am. The Senator from Vermont is correct, and that knowledge on my part is in part for the reasons I've introduced, or filed, I should say, the amendment that we're discussing right now.
I thank the Senator.
I thank the Senator from Vermont. Mr. President,
Senator from Arizona.
I yield the floor and
Mr. President.
the quorum.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, for the sake of the accommodation of the schedules of my colleagues, I would ask unanimous consent that following my remarks and whoever the speaker is on the other side, is designated by the chairman, that Senator Ayotte be recognized, and then after one speaker from the other side, if necessary, Senator Chambliss, followed by speaker on the other side, followed by Senator Graham. I do that so that because of the time constraints of my colleagues. So I'd ask unanimous consent agreement from the senator from Michigan.
Reserving the right to object, and I think it's a valid request, I'd ask that I be allowed to just call up and then set aside, before you go into the series of speakers, call up and then set aside SA 1072, which is sponsored by myself and Senator Graham, and there's a list of 67 other senators.
President, I yield to the senator from Vermont. This is the National Guard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
I thank my friend from Arizona. I'd ask to call up amendment number 1072.
Without objection, so ordered.
And
Clerk will report.
The senator from Vermont, Mr. Leahy, for himself and others, proposes amendment number 1072.
And, Mr. President, this is on behalf of myself, Senator Graham, Senator Rockefeller, Senator Ayotte, Senator Caucus, Senators Alexander, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Bigeman, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxers, Scott Brown, Sherrod Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Copper, Casey, Coates, Conrad, Coons, Corker, Crapo, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Heller, Hovind, Inhofe, Inouye, Johans, Ron Johnson, Tim Johnson, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Lee, Lugar, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murray, Ben Nelson, Pryor, Risch, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Toomey, Mark Udall, Vitter, Warner, Whitehouse, and Wyden. And it's been called up. I would consent to have it set aside so that we can go on and continue with the pending matter.
Without objection. Without objection, the foregoing request from the senator from Arizona is
reserving the right to object.
Senator from Michigan.
And I don't object because that is the way we should proceed, going back and forth. Usually we do that informally, and I don't know whether or not if the senator, whether there may be implications, because I don't know who's speaking. I have no objection.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank my friend from Michigan. I do that for the convenience of my colleagues because I know that there are others who will also be coming to speak on this important issue. I'd like to point out that the senator from South Carolina, a member of the National Guard, author and one of the major authors of the Detainee Treatment Act, a person who has tried hundreds of cases in military courts, I think brings a degree of knowledge and expertise on this issue. The senator from New Hampshire has served as Attorney General of her state for a number of years. She understands the Miranda rights. She has been a student and leader on this issue of the detainee treatment. And, of course, Senator Chambliss, in his role as the Republican leader on the Intelligence Committee, has a deep and long-standing involvement on detainee issues and the requirements for making our nation safe. I'll be fairly brief, except to say that by any judgment, the President's policy, the President's strategy, the President's movements concerning detainees has been a total and abysmal failure. And if the President of the United States had had a coherent policy that would have made any sense whatsoever to anyone, we would not have had to act as the Senate Armed Services Committee. Let me point out a couple of facts. The President of the United States campaigned saying that he would close Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay remains open. He said, the President of the United States also said that we would have detainees tried in civilian as well as military court. That was a position that he's held. So they had the great idea. They had a great idea. Let's take Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to New York City. That was a great idea. Let's have $300 million in security costs while they have a trial of one of the most notorious international criminals. Obviously, that one got the support that it deserved. We now have, thanks to the release policy of Guantanamo, 27% of the detainees of Guantanamo who have been released are back in the fight, trying to kill Americans. Only this time they've got a red badge of courage and a degree of legitimacy because they spent time in Guantanamo Bay. Leaders of al-Qaeda have been released from Guantanamo Bay under this administration. Now, they were released under the Bush administration as well, to be fair. But we didn't know at that time how many of them would return to the fight. So some of the leaders in Yemen that we're speaking about that are now doing everything they can to kill Americans were released from Guantanamo Bay. That can't be viewed as a successful policy. 30 individuals in Guantanamo today are Yemens, are citizens of Yemen. We can't release them, obviously, back to Yemen. So now what do we do in order not to have people go to Guantanamo Bay? We are now using U.S. naval ships to detain suspected terrorists. For 60 days, they kept a suspected al-Qaeda member on board a ship. Now, Mr. President, when I support the construction of more Navy ships, I had a lot of missions in mind. Serving as a detainment facility for suspected terrorists is not one of them. The underwear bomber was Mirandized 50 minutes into custody. And the senator from Illinois forgot to mention that several weeks went by before the underwear bomber's family came and convinced him to cooperate. Suppose that there had been an impending attack on the United States of America during that period of time after this guy, after 50 minutes in captivity, was Mirandized. Most Americans don't believe that al-Qaeda members should be Mirandized. And as the senator from New Hampshire will point out, she's had a lot of experience with individuals who have exercised their Miranda rights. So the administration policy has been a complete failure. What we are trying to do in this legislation, and we have tried and tried again to satisfy many of the concerns that the administration has, and I would point out we did certain things such as make this legislation only for 1 year, not permanent, but only for 1 year. And we have issued and we have put into this legislation a national security waiver, which is a mile wide. If the President of the United States decides that this individual should not be that an individual should be given a trial in civilian court, that he has a waiver that all he has to do is exercise. So I'm not exactly sure why the administration feels so strongly about a 1-year restriction with a national security waiver that's a mile wide. We made a couple of other changes at the request of the administration. So I can only assume that somehow this has some sort of political implications, as most of, and I don't say that lightly, as most of the actions concerning this whole detainee issue seem to be driven by. So there was hearings held in the Senate Armed Services Committee. There was input from all different sources. The senator from Michigan is not a renowned, has been fair and objective on this issue, and I'm very appreciative of that. The vote in the Senate Armed Services Committee was, I believe, 26-0, and we feel very strongly that these provisions in this bill are necessary to keep Americans secure. And we want to stop 1 out of every 4 more than 1 out of every 4 of these detainees from going back into the fight. We want to make sure that the military court system applies here to people who are non-citizens and known members of al-Qaeda. And all of it seems to me to make perfect sense. So obviously the administration ratcheted up the stakes today with a threat of a veto. I hope that they're not serious about it. There's too much in this bill that are important to this nation's defense. I yield the floor.
I wonder if
Senator from Michigan.
we can amend the unanimous consent request. There's nobody that I know of on this side at the moment that wants to speak in support of the amendment. So I'm wondering if it would be agreeable to the ranking member to have 2 members on your side go and then 2 members on our side, should that appear.
That's not agreeable to me. I'd say that they have the ability to walk over here and if they're interested.
In that case, I note the absence of a quorum.
It's not fair.
I don't want you to agree that it's not fair.
It's not fair.
I'm in opposition to the amendment, so I want to be
Has
fair.
the senator from Arizona agreed to the request from the senator from Michigan?
I agree.
Okay. Without objection, so ordered.
Okay. Mr. President.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the motion of the senator from Colorado, and as the ranking member, as the vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, let me just say in response to the statement from the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee that there has not been a lack of discussion of this issue, both within the Armed Services Committee and within the Intelligence Committee. While I'm not permitted to talk about what has gone on within the Intelligence Committee, I assure you that this has been a major issue from a discussion standpoint for a number of months. In fact, it's been a point of discussion for almost 3 years now, and I'll get into some of that in my comments. And secondly, just in quick response to the comment from the senator from Illinois, the assistant majority leader, when he talked about how we would treat United States citizens under this, obviously, and I know how smart he is, and he's my friend, he hadn't read the bill. There's a specific exclusion for citizens of the United States being required to be detained by the military in this bill. But over the past several years, there's been an ongoing debate concerning our nation's ability to fully and lawfully interrogate suspected terrorists. One thing remains clear. After all these years after 9/11, we still lack an unambiguous and effective detention policy. The consequences of that failure are very real. If we had captured bin Laden, what would we have done with him? If we had captured Anwar al-Awlaki, what would we have done with him? If today we capture Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, what would we do with him? Many of us have posed these same questions to various administration officials, and the wide variety of responses only confirms that there is no policy. That's unacceptable, and that's why the detainee provisions in this bill are so absolutely critical. I think it's fair to say that if we had captured bin Laden or al-Awlaki, we could have gained very actionable intelligence from either one of them, and that's our primary goal, Mr. President. But how would we have done that? Because we have no detainee policy, there is no place we could have taken them for long-term interrogation. The closest thing to a policy that we have heard from the administration is that Guantanamo is off the table. But that's just not helpful when they provide no other alternatives. We've heard some administration officials say that holding detainees on ships for brief periods of time solves this detention problem. Now, Senator McCain just addressed that issue, and, you know, we've got a great United States Navy. It's not the intention of the United States Navy to function in a way of sailing ships around the world and having terrorists brought to ships for detention. A state-of-the-art facility like Guantanamo Bay is off the table, but holding someone on a ship never intended to be a floating prison and prohibited from long-term detention by the Geneva Conventions is somehow a humane replacement for Guantanamo. And that simply does not make sense. The intent behind the detainee provisions in this bill is very simple. We must be able to hold detainees for as long as it takes to get significant foreign intelligence information without them lawyering up, as the Christmas Day bomber did so famously after only 50 minutes of interrogation. And again, to my friend from Illinois, who talked about the fact that once this young man's parents got involved, that after his Miranda rights had been given to him, he gave us an awful lot of intelligence. And that is true in his case. But, Mr. President, I doubt very seriously that Zawahiri's parents, who probably aren't even alive, are going to step up and tell their son, you really ought to go in and talk to these folks and give them all the details about the way you helped plan the September 11 attacks on the United States of America. We just know that with high-value targets, that's not going to happen on a wholesale basis, and we simply need to be in a position to gain actionable intelligence from every one of those individuals. While I fully support the detainee provisions in this bill, I believe there are other improvements that can and should be made. For example, I am co-sponsoring Senator Ayotte's amendment, which will allow our intelligence interrogators to use lawful interrogation methods beyond those set forth in the Army Field Manual. Now, we need to be clear on exactly what this means. This amendment does not authorize or condone torture, and every technique used in every interrogation must comply with our laws and treaty obligations. I believe there needs to be flexibility in how we interrogate terrorists. But even more so, I believe it is foolish to publicize, as the Army Field Manual does, the specific techniques that can be used in interrogating a suspected terrorist. Over the years, we have heard repeatedly from the intelligence community that the element of surprise is sometimes our greatest asset in gathering timely intelligence from detainees. Senator Ayotte's amendment gives the intelligence community the ability to use techniques that have not been broadcast over the Internet. And in my opinion, that makes a lot of sense, and I hope my colleagues will agree, because, Madam President, the folks that we are dealing with in the terrorist world today, these guys who are the meanest, nastiest killers in the world, who wake up every morning trying to figure out ways to kill and harm Americans, are not stupid. They carry laptops. They know how to use the Internet, because we gain valuable information oftentimes through the airwaves. We know how smart they are, and we know that they have the capability of going on the Internet today and reviewing the Army Field Manual. They know exactly the way they're going to be interrogated and the type of techniques that are going to be used to gain intelligence from them. Madam President, the Armed Services Committee has worked very hard on a bipartisan basis to come up with legislation that will improve congressional oversight of detainee matters, as well as provide greater assurance that detainees who pose a threat to our national security are not released so that they can return to the fight. As the Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I have specific interest in making sure that our intelligence community has the ability to gather timely and actionable intelligence from detainees. I believe this bill will help our intelligence interrogators do exactly that, and I urge my colleagues to support these provisions fully, as was done on a unanimous basis within the Armed Services Committee when this issue was discussed, debated, and talked about thoroughly during the markup. Madam President, I would yield to my friend from New Hampshire.
The floor. Back and forth.
I'm sorry, I thought you gave us two,
You did, yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
You had to, I believe. You're number 2, I think.
That's fine.
I think that's what the chairman meant, is it would be 2 if there was...
If we did not have somebody here, we were going to do it 2 at a time.
Yeah, I think it's the other sides.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam President, and I appreciate the courtesy of the Senator from New Hampshire. I will not speak long. I know she is here waiting to be heard as we go back and forth across the aisle in sequence. I want to begin by thanking Chairman Levin and his ranking member, Senator McCain, for the work that they have done on this detention issue. I think they've made a lot of progress, and I look forward to continuing work on the floor to try to conclude what I hope will be a successful agreement for everyone. But I'm here to speak about Amendment 1092 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the piece that has been put in that responds to the serious and ever-growing problem of counterfeit parts that appear in our military supply chain. Our nation asks a lot of our troops. We send them far away. We send them into danger. We ask them to suffer prolonged separation from their families. We ask them to put their life and limb in peril. And in return, we have a high obligation to give them the best possible equipment to fulfill their vital missions and come home safely. And in order to assure the proper performance of our weapon systems, of our body armor, of our aircraft parts, and of countless other mission-critical parts, we have to make sure that they are legitimate and not counterfeit parts. That's why I introduced the Combating Military Counterfeits Act, which was reported without objection by the Judiciary Committee on July 21st of this year. It is co-sponsored by my colleague Senator Graham, who I see here on the floor, by the ranking member, Senator McCain. Again, my appreciations to him. Senator Coons, the chairman of Judiciary, Chairman Leahy, Senator Kyle, Senator Schumer, Senator Hatch, Senator Blumenthal, and Senator Klobuchar. And I want to thank all of those co-sponsors for their support and leadership on this important issue. I particularly want to thank Chairman Levin and Ranking Member McCain for including this in their Amendment 1092, which was offered earlier today. Senator Levin and Senator McCain led an in-depth investigation in the Armed Services Committee into this problem of military counterfeits, and they have drawn on that investigation in making these important reforms that will protect military procurement from counterfeit parts. I'm very glad that they believe, as I do, that enhanced criminal penalties in my bill would provide a useful complement to those important changes. Prosecutors have a really important role to play in the fight against military counterfeiters. The criminals who sell counterfeit military products should not get off with light sentences. They knowingly sell the military, for instance, counterfeit body armor that could fail in combat, or a counterfeit missile control system that could short-circuit at launch, or a counterfeit GPS that could fail under battlefield conditions. The Combating Military Counterfeits Act of 2011 makes sure that appropriate criminal sanctions attach to such reprehensible criminal activity. First, by doubling the maximum statutory penalty for an individual who traffics in counterfeits and knows that the counterfeit product is intended for military use or identified as meeting military standards. And second, by directing the Sentencing Commission to update the sentencing guidelines as appropriate to reflect our congressional intent that trafficking in counterfeit military items be punished seriously, sufficiently to deter this kind of reckless endangering of our service members. The administration has called for these increased sentences for trafficking in counterfeit military products. In the private sector, this legislation is supported by the United States Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Semiconductor Industry Association, DuPont, the International Trademark Association, and the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition. I thank all of them for their work and leadership on this issue. One semiconductor manufacturer, ON Semiconductor, which has a development center in East Greenwich in my home state of Rhode Island, has written a letter of support explaining that military counterfeits are a particular problem since military-grade products are attractive to counterfeiters because their higher prices reflect the added cost to test the products to military specifications, specifications that include the full military temperature range. So it's a target area for counterfeiters, and I will say, without going on at any great length, that the examples are really shocking. The Defense Department, for instance, has found out in testing that what it thought was Kevlar body armor was, in fact, nothing of the sort and could not protect our troops the way proper Kevlar can. In another example, a supplier sold the Defense Department a part that it falsely claimed was a $7,000 circuit that met the specifications of a missile guidance system. A January 2010 study by the Commerce Department quoted a Defense Department official as estimating that counterfeit aircraft parts were leading to a 5 to 15% annual decrease in weapon system reliability. The investigation led by Chairman Levin and Ranking Member McCain revealed countless other grave and sobering examples. I'm glad that we are responding to the serious and ever-growing threat posed by counterfeit military parts. Again, I thank Chairman Levin and Ranking Member McCain for their great work to eliminate counterfeit parts from the military supply chain, and I hope all my colleagues will support their amendment number 1092. And I yield the floor.
Madam President, I'm sorry. Madam President, first let me thank Senator Whitehouse for the extraordinary effort that he's made to go after counterfeit parts. And we have incorporated his legislation in our legislation. It's a critically important part of our legislation. But his leadership has been early, often strong on this issue, and we commend him for it, thank him for it, and hopefully that this amendment, when it gets passed, that there will be a recognition of the critical role that the senator from Rhode Island played in this. And it's an ongoing saga to stop counterfeiting coming in mainly from China, and this would be a major effort to stem that flow. And Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President, could I just add my appreciation, words of appreciation along those with the chairman for Senator Whitehouse's hard work on this very important issue. Madam President, I yield.
Madam President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise in opposition to the amendment offered by the senator from Colorado to strike the detainee provisions from the defense authorization markup, provisions that were agreed upon on an overwhelming bipartisan basis in the Armed Services Committee. And I'd like to start first by revisiting the history of this and where we are, because the reason that the Armed Services Committee in the first place thought it was very important that we discuss this issue in committee and address it is that having participated in hearings over the course of months and months in the Armed Services Committee, there has been witness after witness from our Defense Department who has come in, and our military leaders who we have been talking about the detention policy with and asking them very important questions about where we are and how we're going to ensure that our military and intelligence community has the tools that they need to protect America, and also asking them about this issue of detainees and how we're treating them, because one of the important facts that my esteemed colleague from Georgia, as well as the ranking member, Senator McCain, mentioned, is that we have a recidivism rate of 27% from Guantanamo, those who have re-engaged our soldiers again and are back in theater. And I was very concerned about this in the Armed Services Committee, and so that caused over a series of months for us to ask about the administration's detainee policy. I just want to share some of the comments that were made over that period of time. In February, Secretary Michael Vickers said that the administration is in the final stages of revising or establishing its detention policy. Now, that was 8 months ago, and we're now 10 years into this war. In April, I questioned General Carter Ham, the commander of Africa Command, about what we would do if we captured a member of al-Qaeda in Africa. And you know what he told me? He said, quote, "We'd need some lawyerly help on answering that one." So this is an area that cried out for clarification on a bipartisan basis because it's so important to ensure, while we remain at war with terrorists, that we have the right policies in place to protect Americans. And that's why the Armed Services Committee worked very hard. I want to thank the chairman of the committee, Chairman Levin, for his diligent work, along with other members of the committee, for coming forward with this provision that the senator from Colorado is seeking to strike, as well as the ranking member, Senator McCain. And what ended up happening is we brought forward a compromise that passed overwhelmingly out of committee originally in June. In fact, it passed out 25-1. And then the administration raised some concerns about it. And in reaction to those concerns, I know that the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, as well as the ranking member, and some others of us, including myself, sat down with members of the administration to hear out their concerns and to try to accommodate their concerns while still making sure that we had a policy that would give proper guidance, would protect Americans, and would fundamentally deal with this issue of making sure, in the first instance, that we reaffirmed our authority that we're at war with al-Qaeda post 9/11. Second, reaffirming that when we're at war, the presumption is military custody because the priority has to be gathering intelligence to protect our country. And then third, those who are released from Guantanamo, making sure that there's a standard in place so that they can't re-engage back in the battle to harm our troops, our partners, our allies. And in that process, that's how this provision that Senator Udall from Colorado seeks to strike with his amendment. If we were to eliminate these provisions, we would be putting our country in a position where these important issues are not being addressed, and they need to be addressed, just based on what we have heard from our military leadership over many months in the Armed Services Committee. And so I would also echo what Senator Chambliss, who is the Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, said. This is an issue that has been thoroughly discussed in this body and cries out for passage in the Defense Authorization Act. Wanted to point out a couple of very, very important parts to this. Now, I'm someone who, on the recent appropriations bill, the CJS appropriations bill, brought an amendment that would have provided for military trials, commissions trials for members of al-Qaeda and associated forces who are committing an attack against us or our coalition partners, because I am deeply concerned that this administration has been treating these types of cases as common criminal cases. When I brought that amendment forward, it did not pass this body. I still feel very strongly that the policy should be that we treat these cases for what they are, military cases, because we remain at war and our priority should be to gather intelligence. But I wanted to point out the fact that after my amendment lost, I sat down with the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the ranking member, and the administration to hear out their concerns. And so while this amendment, I would have gone further in my amendment, this amendment addresses many of the objections that were raised. In fact, I think all the objections that were raised to the amendment that I brought to the floor from the other side. And that is, we have given the administration flexibility to make the decision on whether or not they believe it's appropriate, based on national security concerns, which has to be the primary concern and consideration, to treat those who have committed an attack on our country, who are members of al-Qaeda or associated forces, and also who are not members of this country, so who are foreign citizens and are seeking to attack our country or have attacked our country, in a way that the administration can decide, is it best to handle them in a civilian court or a military system. So all of the objections that were raised to my amendment, I stand by my amendment, but they are addressed in this compromise. And to hear the objection to it, that there isn't flexibility, that's very clear that that's just not true when you look at the language in this amendment, because we adjusted the amendment to address the administration's concerns, to say no interrogation will be interrupted based upon this amendment, that interrogation has to be the priority, and we're giving the administration maximum flexibility under this amendment. So I don't understand why there are such objections continuing when this is as a result of a very good, strong, good faith effort to address any operational concerns that were raised based on the amendment that I brought and even based on the prior language, which, in my view, I think was very sufficient. I want to point out something that's very, very important. In the course of the discussions we had with the administration, on Section 1031, which we have heard cited as a section that could be used to detain Americans indefinitely, this section was changed based on feedback from the administration. In fact, the administration asked us to actually strike a provision in it that would have said that American citizens, it did not apply to American citizens, and in fact had to comply with the Constitution of the United States. So I'm a little bit apoplectic to understand why the administration is raising an objection about something that they actually asked to be removed on a section that they told us they were satisfied with, and based on revisions that we made that they wanted. And we said we'd be happy to make these accommodations because we want to make sure that we get this right. So on that section, I really don't understand why we are in a position where the senator from Colorado is trying to remove it, the administration is objecting to it, when we took the language that they gave to us and incorporated it directly into the National Defense Authorization Act. One point I think is being lost here. So why is it that this amendment creates an initial presumption for military custody? This is the most important point here. The priority has to be in protecting American citizens by gaining valuable intelligence to protect our country. The esteemed senator from Illinois cited the case of the so-called Christmas Day or underwear bomber as an example of how cases have worked well. Well, I think it's really important to appreciate the facts of that case. This is a situation where the underwear bomber is caught with the explosives strapped to him, where there are hundreds of witnesses on the plane, and they were able to make their case in the absence of any interrogation or confession. And what ended up happening is he was questioned at the scene for about 50 minutes, and then he was read his Miranda rights, one of those being you have the right to remain silent. Let's think about that for a second. We would want to tell terrorists you have the right to remain silent. Common sense will tell you telling a terrorist you have the right to remain silent is counter to what we need to do to protect Americans. We don't want them to remain silent. We want them to tell us everything that they know. But continuing on with that case, the only reason that he re-engaged in providing information for our country is because his parents intervened. Weeks later, his parents convinced him that he should cooperate with us, that he should provide information and tell us what he knew. If our interrogation policy for people who commit attacks on our country is going to be, well, we hope that a parent comes and intervenes to help us get information that will protect Americans, I think that we're in trouble if that's our intelligence gathering procedures. So I just wanted to point out, since that case was cited as an example by the senator from Colorado and the senator from Illinois as to why this section should be struck, if anything, I think that case points out why we need guidance in this area and why it's very, very important that the priority be on gathering intelligence. And that's what this amendment does. It gives the administration sufficient flexibility based on concerns that they raised, operational concerns. If the FBI is conducting an interrogation, they do not have to stop it because of anything in this provision. That's very, very clear. If the administration wants to treat someone in a civilian court, even though I don't think they should, versus a military commission who is a member of al-Qaeda, who has attacked our country, that waiver is in here, that flexibility is in here. This was a reasonable compromise where people like me who would have gone a lot further didn't get what we wanted, but what we did do is get a very, very strong bipartisan compromise that came out of this committee overwhelmingly. When we had a vote at the beginning of this week and the senator from Colorado raised the very same amendment to strike this provision, it was rejected overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis. So I hope that this floor will also overwhelmingly reject striking this very important provision from the National Defense Authorization Act. Again, we can't be in a position where we spend the next year in the Armed Services Committee again hearing from our military leaders. The administration is still in the final stages of revising or establishing its detention policy. And I certainly don't want to hear again from one of our generals when I ask him about our detention policy and what we're going to do with terrorists, that I'd need some lawyerly help on answering that one. This amendment gives us the guidance we need, and I would ask my colleagues to reject striking it from the authorization. Thank you very much, Madam President. I yield the floor.